Claude responded. Dr. Nadia Osai had been reviewing the overnight chart notes for 40 minutes when the elevator doors opened, and Marcus Whitfield walked in wearing a hospital gown and the particular expression of a man who has never once considered that his luck might run out. I recognized him before he recognized me. That was the advantage I had always had. I had spent years learning to see people clearly, the way you learn to see everything clearly when nobody is looking at you. He was thinner than I remembered. His color was wrong. The nurse beside him, Priya Ratan, was reading vitals off a tablet and saying something about his blood pressure, and Marcus was nodding without listening, the way he always nodded without listening, and then he turned and his eyes found my face, and for exactly 3 seconds neither of us moved. I was the attending addiction medicine physician on call at Hargrove Ellison Medical Center. My name was on the department letterhead. My name was on the admission form I had signed 11 hours earlier. My name was, at that moment, the only reason Marcus Whitfield was alive. He said, "Nadia," I said, "Mr. Whitfield, good morning, I'm Dr. Osai. I'll be coordinating your care today." I set the chart down. I did not look away from him. I had been waiting for this moment for longer than he would ever understand, and I had decided a long time ago that I was going to meet it with complete stillness. I signed the admission. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told that your work, your purpose, the thing you gave your whole life to, was somehow an embarrassment to someone who should have been proud of you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because what I am about to tell you did not happen in one night. It happened over 14 years. And the night in that hospital room was just the moment when 14 years finally came to a single point. But to understand why that moment meant what it did, I have to take you back. 14 years back, to a dining room table in Silver Creek, Ohio, and a conversation I have never repeated to anyone until now. I was 29 years old, and I had just been accepted into the Addiction Medicine Fellowship at the University of Carrington School of Medicine. It was a 2-year program. It was competitive, 47 applicants for 6 positions. I had applied twice. The first time I was rejected without comment. The second time I received a letter from Dr. Solomon Ape, the fellowship director, that said my clinical observations on opioid use disorder in underserved communities showed a perspective this program has needed for some time. I read that letter standing in the parking lot of the Eastfield Community Clinic, where I was working as a general internal medicine physician, and I cried so hard that a man walking to his car asked if I needed a glass of water. I drove to my parents' house that evening because I wanted to tell them in person. My mother, Gloria Osai, had made jollof rice, which in our family meant celebration was either expected or required. My father was on the couch. My sister Adiz was there with Marcus, who she had been dating for about 8 months, and who she had decided, with the certainty she brought to all her decisions, was the man she was going to marry. Marcus Whitfield came from what my sister called a legacy family. His father had been a city councilman. His uncle had played 2 seasons in the NFL. The Whitfields owned 3 auto dealerships in the greater Columbus area, and they attended a church where the pastor knew the governor's wife by her first name. Adiz had never said any of this out loud in those exact terms, but she had arranged all of it in the space between her words for as long as she and Marcus had been together, and everyone in the room understood the arrangement perfectly. I sat down at the table. I waited until my mother had set out the food. Then I said that I had been accepted into the fellowship at Carrington. I said it was a 2-year program in addiction medicine. I said I would be specializing in the treatment of substance use disorders. My mother said, "God has been good." My father put down his fork and looked at me with the expression he only had when something moved him too much to contain. Marcus Whitfield set down his glass and said, "Addiction medicine." "So like rehab doctors," I said, "it's a board-certified subspecialty. It focuses on the full continuum of substance use disorder treatment, medication-assisted therapy, withdrawal management, long-term recovery planning. It's a growing field." Marcus said, "Huh." My sister said, "That's interesting, Nadia." What Adiz meant when she said something was interesting was that she had decided it was beneath comment, but courtesy required her to produce a syllable. I had known this since we were children. Then Marcus said, "I just feel like, and I mean this in a supportive way, it's a little dark, isn't it? Like you spent all those years in medical school to work with addicts." My father said, "Marcus." Marcus said, "No, I'm just saying, Ada's going to be in finance. The Whitfield name carries a cert, we have a profile in this community. I'm not trying to be rude, I just think about how it looks." Adiz said nothing. She moved her food around her plate. And there it was, not a rejection of me. A rejection of the specific thing I had chosen, the field I had studied, the patients I had decided to spend my life serving, the exact discipline in which I had just been told I showed a perspective the field had needed. Marcus Whitfield had decided in approximately 45 seconds that my life's work was an aesthetic problem for his family's reputation. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her plate. I said, "I appreciate your perspective, Marcus." Then I asked my father if he wanted more rice, and I let the conversation move on to other things, the way it always moved on, the way it had always moved on, even when the thing it was moving on from had required everything I had. Later that night, my mother came to my old bedroom while I was packing my bag. She stood in the doorway and she said, "You know Adiz doesn't mean anything by it." I said, "I know." She said, "Marcus is just, he's protective of the family." I said, "I know." She said, "You'll find your place, Nadia, you always do." I didn't say anything after that because what I wanted to say was, I already found my place. I found it twice. I applied twice. I was rejected and I applied again and I found it. But I understood that this was not a conversation she was having with me. It was a conversation she was having with the part of herself that needed things to stay smooth, and there was no room for me in that conversation. I zipped my bag. I turned off the light. In my wallet, folded between my library card and a note I had written to myself after my first fellowship rejection, was a piece of paper with 2 words on it: patient outcomes. That was what I had written to myself after the rejection letter. Patient outcomes. That was why I was doing it, not for the Whitfield family's profile, not for my sister's comfort, not for any room I would ever be invited into or excluded from. That piece of paper stayed in my wallet for 6 years. The fellowship at Carrington had turned down my request for departmental funding. There was a research grant I had applied for, the Meridian Foundation Clinical Research Award, worth $42,000, that would have allowed me to complete a small study on medication-assisted treatment retention rates in rural counties. I did not receive it. I found this out on a Tuesday afternoon in October, sitting in the shared office space I used at Carrington's addiction medicine department, and I sat with it for approximately 15 minutes before I pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote down every other possible source of funding I could think of. I did not call my parents. I did not call Adiz. I called Dr. Yolanda Ferris, my fellowship supervisor, who answered on the second ring. Dr. Ferris was 61 years old and had been practicing addiction medicine since before it was a recognized specialty. She had the manner of a woman who has witnessed so much suffering that ordinary discomfort registered to her as barely a weather change, and she treated her fellows with a combination of complete professional rigor and the specific warmth of someone who has never stopped believing that the work matters. She had recruited me personally into a pilot clinic she was running. She said she had read my application essay 3 times, and that was the first time in 11 years she had read any fellow's application essay more than once. She said, "The grant committee is conservative. You were too direct about the rural demographic." I said, "It's the actual population I want to study." She said, "I know. Write it again next cycle and let me read the draft first. In the meantime, I have a department budget line I can free up for a smaller version of the same data collection. It won't give you the full study. It'll give you enough to publish a preliminary finding." That preliminary finding became the basis of a paper I co-authored with Dr. Ferris and published 18 months later in the Journal of Addiction Medicine. The paper was cited in a policy brief that went to the Ohio State Health Department. The policy brief contributed to a funding expansion for rural substance use disorder clinics that was approved in 2015. None of this was visible to my family. None of this was communicated to them because they had made it clear, not in words, but in the architecture of their attention, that the work was not something they needed to see. Adiz got engaged to Marcus in the spring of the year my paper was published. She called to tell me. She was warm, excited, full of the particular brightness she had when she was certain she had made the correct decision. She said they were planning a ceremony for the following June. She said it would be at the Whitfield family's estate in Dublin, Ohio. She said it would be about 250 guests. She did not say, "I hope you'll be there." I said, "That sounds beautiful, congratulations." She said, "Marcus just wants it to be the right feeling, you know, we're going to be really intentional about the guest list." I heard what she was saying. I understood what she was not saying. I filed it and moved on. The invitation did not come. I completed my fellowship in June of 2013. I passed my addiction medicine board examination on the first attempt. I joined the faculty at Carrington as a clinical instructor, which meant I was paid $61,000 a year to teach fellows, see patients in the affiliated outpatient clinic, and slowly, methodically build a record that could not be dismissed. The outpatient clinic was called the Eastfield Recovery and Wellness Center. It had been running for 3 years when I joined its clinical staff. It operated on a sliding scale fee model, and it served patients whose health insurance coverage was limited or non-existent, Medicaid patients, uninsured patients, patients who had cycled through emergency departments enough times that the ER staff knew their first names. These were the patients Marcus Whitfield had called addicts. These were the patients he had implied made my work dark. I kept meticulous medical records. I developed a patient tracking protocol that reduced treatment dropout rates in our clinic by 17% over 2 years. I presented this work at the American Society of Addiction Medicine annual conference in 2015, in a session chaired by Dr. Ferris, in front of 400 physicians, researchers, and policymakers. Afterwards, a man I did not know came up to me and introduced himself as Dr. Raymond Chu, the director of clinical programs at Hargrove Ellison Medical Center in Columbus. He said he had been looking for someone to build out an inpatient addiction medicine consult service. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, "In clinical practice, 2 years since board certification. In the field, closer to 6. He said, "Are you happy where you are?" I thought about what happy meant exactly in that context. I said, "I'm building something." He said, "Come build it somewhere bigger." I did not say yes immediately. I asked for the description of the position in writing. I asked to meet the department heads. I reviewed the hospital's medical records infrastructure, because any specialist appointment within a shared system lives or dies on how information moves through that system, and I had seen enough broken systems to know which questions to ask before I walked into one. The position at Hargrove Ellison was a senior attending physician role, addiction medicine. It came with a 12-bed inpatient consultation service and a mandate to develop a formal outpatient bridge program for patients transitioning out of acute care. I was to be the architect of that program. My title would be Director of Addiction Medicine Services. My starting salary was $114,000. I accepted in November of 2015. I started in January of 2016. My mother asked how my job was going. I said, "Good." My father sent me a card that said, "Proud of you." I kept it on my desk. I did not tell either of them what the job actually was. I did not tell them the title. I did not tell them the salary. I did not tell them about the program I was building, the 12 beds, the bridge protocol, the grant application I had filed with Hargrove Ellison's research office for a statewide training initiative. This was not cruelty. This was clarity. I had understood something in that dining room in Silver Creek. The validation they were capable of giving me was not the validation I needed. The work did not require their witness to be real. I bought a 2-bedroom condo in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus with a down payment that came entirely from money I had saved, and a small equity loan against investment property my mentor Dr. Ferris helped me identify. I hired a financial advisor, a woman named Constance Park at Meridian Wealth Planning, who helped me set up my first retirement savings account and a separate account I called, in my own private spreadsheet, the buffer money I put aside against the possibility of my parents ever needing help that my sister would not be positioned to give them. I filed all of my medical expenses through the hospital's insurance policy. I kept my own records separately, a habit from my fellowship years, when I had learned that the health insurance coverage your employer provides is only as reliable as your documentation of what you're entitled to. In October of 2017, Dr. Raymond Chu called me into his office and told me he was recommending me for promotion to Associate Medical Director of Clinical Programs. The promotion would come with an administrative expansion, a departmental budget of $640,000, and a seat at the Medical Executive Committee. He said the committee had reviewed my 2-year outcomes data and that my bridge program had the best 60-day readmission reduction rate of any addiction medicine service in the state hospital network. I sat across from him in his office. Through the window behind him I could see the parking structure and beyond it a strip of gray November sky. He said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Ready." That evening I went to my condo. I made tea. I sat in the chair by the window that looked out at the street below, and I took the old wallet out of my coat pocket. I had carried it since medical school, brown leather, worn soft, and I opened it and took out the piece of paper that said patient outcomes. It was creased down the center, and the ink had faded in one corner, but the words were still there. I had thought about throwing it away dozens of times. I had thought about it the day the paper was published, the day I passed the boards, the day I accepted the position at Hargrove Ellison. Each time I put it back. I put it back that night too. I had come that close in those quiet years to letting something slip, a detail here, a title there, a moment where the pride became too large to keep private. A holiday phone call with my mother where I had started to say the department before I caught myself. A moment at my cousin's birthday party where Adiz had asked what I was working on, and I had said clinical quality instead of the full answer, and she had nodded and turned back to her conversation with Marcus's brother. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. By the time Adiz's wedding came and went without me in June of 2016, I had already been at Hargrove Ellison for 5 months. I know this because I remember what I was doing the weekend of her wedding. I was on call. A 24-year-old named Deshaun Mercer came into the emergency department at 2 in the morning in precipitated withdrawal from an ill-timed buprenorphine dose, and I spent 4 hours stabilizing him, and then another hour talking with his mother in the waiting room, explaining what had happened and what we were going to do next. His mother's name was Beverly Mercer. She worked the night shift at a packaging plant in Reynoldsburg, and she had taken a personal day to be at the hospital. She held her son's hand and listened to me with complete attention, and she said at the end, "Thank you for treating him like a person." I thought about that a lot in the years that followed. That was the work. That was what Marcus Whitfield had called dark. The invitation had not come. My mother had called me 3 days before the wedding with a particular hesitance in her voice that I recognized as the sound of someone about to ask a favor they know they shouldn't need to ask. She said, "Adiz wants the day to be very specific. You know how she is." I said, "I know." She said, "Marcus's family is very traditional." I said, "I understand." My mother said, "She loves you, Nadia." I said, "I know." And I did know. I knew Adiz loved me with the specific love of a person who has decided that a certain version of you is acceptable, and the rest must be managed. And that love had its shape and its limits, and I had learned both precisely enough that they could no longer surprise me. I sent a card and a Le Creuset Dutch oven which Adiz had on her registry. She sent me a thank you note. Handwritten. Lavender ink. She had always had beautiful handwriting. The years at Hargrove Ellison were not without their difficulties. In 2017, I lost a patient, a 43-year-old named Patricia Gorman, who had been in and out of our program 3 times, and who had achieved what looked like genuine stability before a fentanyl-contaminated batch found its way into the supply she was using. I had adjusted her treatment plan 6 weeks before she died, based on the best available clinical evidence, and I spent 3 weeks afterwards reviewing every decision in that case to see where I might have turned 1 degree differently. There is a particular kind of grief in addiction medicine that doesn't get talked about publicly. Your patients are often people who have been told their deaths are their own fault. The medical system frequently agrees. You carry that knowledge every time you document a case, because the way medical records are structured does not have a category for systemic failure or for the human being who deserved a different outcome. I developed a formal case review protocol at Hargrove Ellison after Patricia Gorman died. Dr. Chu approved it immediately. It became standard practice in the department. I named it in my own notes, privately, the Gorman Protocol. Nobody else knew that. In 2018, a hospital attorney named James Whitmore from the firm Callaway, Whitmore and Briggs reached out to my department regarding a medical records request related to a liability question that had arisen from a patient discharge decision. He was thorough and methodical, and he knew exactly which questions to ask clinicians without alienating them, which is rarer than it should be. I walked him through the documentation on 3 separate cases. At the end of the 3rd meeting he said, "Your record keeping is the best I've seen from a clinical department in this hospital. You should know that." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean it as a genuine observation, not a compliment." I said, "I know the difference." James Whitmore became a professional contact I trusted. Over the next 2 years, he handled 2 matters related to my department. one involving an insurance policy dispute with a managed care organization over inpatient addiction medicine reimbursement rates, and one involving a staff credentialing question that required careful legal language to resolve. Each time, he was precise and effective, and he did not waste words. By January of 2020, I was 42 years old. I had been the director of addiction medicine services at Hargrove Ellison Medical Center for 4 years. I was an associate medical director. My bridge program had been replicated in 3 other Ohio hospitals and cited in 2 state health policy documents. I had trained 11 addiction medicine fellows, 2 of whom had gone on to direct their own programs. My annual salary was $168,000. I had a condo I owned. I had retirement savings that a professional had helped me structure properly. I had a career that was, by any honest accounting, significant. I had not told my family any of this, not the title, not the salary, not the published work, not the fellows I had trained, not the patients I had helped keep alive. In February of 2020, my mother mentioned, in a phone call that was otherwise about a neighbor's roof damage and a sale at the church's annual fundraiser, that Marcus had been struggling. She said it the way she said things she did not want to say directly, embedded in the middle of other sentences, as if proximity to ordinary conversation might soften it. She said, "He's been under a lot of stress. Work things. Adiz is worried." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." My mother said, "She mentioned he's been using some things to cope." I said, "What kinds of things?" My mother paused. She said she didn't specify. I sat with that. I did not say what I was thinking, which was, I know exactly what kinds of things go unspecified in that sentence, and I know exactly what unspecified means in the context of a man under financial stress. And I know because I have spent the last 10 years learning to hear what is not being said by people in exactly this situation. I said, "Tell Adiz she can call me anytime." My mother said, "She knows." I said, "Does she?" My mother did not answer that. I set the phone down and I sat in my office at Hargrove Ellison and I looked at the name placard on my desk, Dr. Nadia Osei Mensah, Director of Addiction Medicine Services. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time. But it wasn't time yet. The call that would make it time came 6 months later. It came at 11:47 on a Friday night. It did not come from Adiz. It came from a number I did not recognize, a Columbus exchange, and when I answered it, the voice on the other end said her name was Dorothea Whitfield, and she was Marcus's mother, and she had found the number for my clinic from a referral card that had been tucked inside her son's jacket pocket, and she said, "Please, he's not breathing right." Claude responded, "I told Dorothea Whitfield to call 911 immediately. I told Dorothea Whitfield to call 911 immediately. I told her to stay on the line with the dispatcher. I told her not to move him, not to give him water, not to do anything except keep him on his side if he was unconscious." She was crying in the particular way of a woman who has spent a lifetime being composed and has run out of composure in the span of 30 seconds. I could hear it in her breathing. I told her my name. I told her I was a physician. I told her I was coming. I was 47 minutes from the Whitfield family home in Dublin, Ohio. I made it in 31. The paramedics were ahead of me by 8 minutes. When I pulled into the driveway, the ambulance was already there, lights going, and I parked behind it and walked to the front door with my identification and my hospital credentials in my hand, because I understood that arriving at a scene, as a physician, requires documentation and clarity, and nothing that looks like panic. A paramedic named Jason Reyes met me at the door. I told him I was the on-call addiction medicine physician at Hargrove Ellison and that I had a clinical history on this patient. He looked at my credentials and stepped aside. Marcus was on the living room floor. He was unconscious but breathing, shallow and slow. The naloxone the paramedics had administered was beginning to work. I crouched beside him and checked his pupils. Pinpoint, starting to dilate. His color was improving. I gave the paramedic team my clinical read and confirmed the transport plan. Hargrove Ellison, because I knew exactly what would happen there, and exactly who would be on the team, and exactly how the bridge from emergency stabilization to a treatment program would be built, because I had built it myself. Dorothea Whitfield stood in the doorway to the kitchen with her hand over her mouth. She was 64 years old and beautifully dressed even at midnight, the kind of woman who does not come apart in front of strangers. She was coming apart now. I stood up. I walked to her. I said, "He's stable. They're going to transport him. He needs inpatient care tonight and a specialist evaluation in the morning. She said, "Are you Adi's sister, the doctor?" I said, "Yes." She said, and then she stopped. I said, "I know what she said. That doesn't matter right now. What matters is that Marcus is going to be all right. I'm going to make sure of that." What Adiz had said, the last time Marcus and his mother had apparently discussed my profession, was that my work was too dark for the Whitfield family's image, and that she would not be inviting me to events where Marcus's professional contacts might ask about her family. Dorothea Whitfield had been in the room for that conversation, which I did not know at the time but would learn later. She had not disagreed. I followed the ambulance to Hargrove Ellison. I signed the admission. I documented the initial clinical picture, ordered the appropriate lab panel, and briefed the overnight team. At 2:15 in the morning, I sat in the attending physician workroom off the third-floor nursing station, and I wrote my intake assessment in the medical record with the precision I brought to every chart, because documentation is the language that medical care speaks to itself across time, and I have never let the circumstances surrounding a case change how carefully I speak it. At 2:47, Adiz arrived. She came through the unit doors in a coat she had pulled on over what she had been sleeping in. Her hair was not done. She looked, for the first time in my adult memory, completely unprepared for what she was walking into. She saw me at the nursing station and she stopped. She said, "Nadia." I said, "He's stable. Room 312. The overnight team is monitoring him." She said, "What are you? How are you?" I said, "Your mother-in-law called my clinic. I was on call." Adiz stood very still for a moment. She looked at the door to room 312. Then she looked back at me. She said, "You admitted him." I said, "Yes." She said, "Shouldn't someone else?" I said, "There is no one else on call tonight in this department with the clinical experience this case requires. I am the director of addiction medicine services at this hospital, Adiz. This is my program. These are my beds." I said it quietly. I did not raise my voice. The overnight nurse at the station, a woman named Carolyn Marsh who had worked with me for 3 years and knew precisely when to become very interested in her computer screen, became very interested in her computer screen. Adiz said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't know you were a director." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I said, "You never asked." That was true. It was not the whole truth, but it was true, and it was the only part of the truth I had any obligation to offer in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning. Adiz went to sit with Marcus. I went back to the workroom. I sat there for a while with my hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I thought about the piece of paper in my wallet that said patient outcomes, and I thought about Beverly Mercer holding her son's hand, and I thought about Patricia Gorman, and I thought about Deshaun Mercer at 2 in the morning in precipitated withdrawal, while a wedding I was not invited to was being planned in Columbus, and I understood with complete clarity that nothing about this night was an accident. Not the years of preparation, not the program I had built, not the number on a referral card in a jacket pocket that led a mother to call my clinic in the middle of the night. All of it had been built in the direction of this. What Adiz was going to do next, that I had not yet predicted. But James Whitmore had handled enough of my department's legal matters that his number was still in my phone, and I was already thinking about what kind of conversation I needed to have in the morning. Marcus spent 6 days in the inpatient unit. During that time, 3 things happened in sequence. The first was that his father, Gerald Whitfield, came to the hospital on day 2. Gerald was the kind of man who fills a room by deciding it needs to be filled, broad shoulders, a handshake that was also a statement of intent, a voice trained by 30 years of civic dinners and dealership ribbon cuttings. He came to the nursing station and asked to speak with the attending physician. Carolyn Marsh paged me. I came down the hall and Gerald Whitfield looked at me for a moment with the assessment he gave to things he did not expect. He said, "You're Adi's sister." I said, "I'm Dr. Osei Mensah, yes, I'm the director of this program and your son's attending physician." He said, "I want him transferred." I said, "To where?" He said, "Somewhere private. I'll pay out of pocket. I don't want this, I don't want Marcus on record here." I said, "Mr. Whitfield, your son is in the middle of a medically supervised stabilization process. A transfer right now would interrupt his treatment in a way that carries clinical risk. If you want to discuss options for ongoing care after discharge, I'm happy to do that. But the medical records for his admission are documentation of care rendered, and they exist regardless of where he goes next." Gerald Whitfield looked at me. He said, "Can you keep this quiet?" I said I follow all applicable privacy regulations with every patient in this program. Your son's health information is protected under federal law. Beyond that, I can't make promises about what I will or will not document because the documentation is the care. It's how we keep him safe. He said, I didn't realize, and then he stopped. I said, what didn't you realize? He said, Adiz never told us what you did, what you actually did. I said, no, she didn't. That was the second thing. Not the conversation itself, but what Gerald Whitfield did after it. He called James Whitmore, not my James Whitmore, but the Whitfield family's own attorney, a man named Philip Hardcastle at Hardcastle and Webb, a firm I knew by reputation because they handled estate work for several prominent Columbus families. Hardcastle called Hargrove Ellison's legal department and asked for a review of my documentation of Marcus's admission. This was within the family's rights. The hospital's legal team informed me of the inquiry, as they were required to. I called James Whitmore at Callaway, Whitmore and Briggs that evening. He had been expecting my call. I had sent him a text at 7 in the morning that said, something is forming that you should know about. He said, walk me through it. I walked him through it. The midnight call, the admission, Gerald Whitfield's request, the Hardcastle inquiry. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I trusted about him. He said, your documentation is clean. I said, my documentation is always clean. He said, then there's no exposure here. They're looking for something that isn't there. I said, I know, but I want to understand what they're actually trying to accomplish. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what's the financial situation in that family? I said, I don't know the specifics. He said, because families like this don't usually call attorneys when they're embarrassed. They call attorneys when something is at stake. He was right. It took me 4 more days to find out what was at stake. The third thing that happened during Marcus's admission was that Adiz came to my office. She had not been to my office before. She did not know what it looked like. She stood in the doorway and took it in, the bookshelf, the framed certifications, the name placard, the whiteboard with the program metrics I updated monthly, the window that looked out over the hospital campus. She looked at it the way you look at something that requires you to revise a significant number of assumptions. She sat down across from me and she said, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, how long have you been here in this position? I said, 4 years in this role, 7 at Hargrove Ellison. She said, and before that, I said, fellowship at Carrington, 2 years clinical faculty there, Eastfield Recovery and Wellness Center. She said, the paper you published. The one Mom mentioned once. The Journal of, I said, Journal of Addiction Medicine, 2014. She said, that was cited in a state policy thing. I said, 2 of them. Adiz looked at her hands. She said, Marcus's insurance policy through the dealership has a mental health rider. I pulled it this morning. I didn't know addiction medicine was covered under the same classification as, I said, it is. Health insurance coverage for substance use disorder treatment is federally mandated under the Mental Health Parity Act. His plan should cover the inpatient stay and a specialist appointment protocol going forward, assuming the primary diagnosis codes are entered correctly. I'll make sure my team uses the right ICD codes. She said, you do that. I said, it's my job, Adiz. She looked at me. She said, I'm sorry we didn't invite you. I said, to the wedding. She said, yes. I said, I know. She said, Marcus thought he had this idea that your work would, he thought it looked a certain way. I said, I heard him say it. She said, in Mom's dining room. I said, yes. She was quiet. Then she said, did it hurt? I thought about how to answer that honestly without performing an emotion I was no longer in the middle of. I said, it did at the time. It doesn't now in the same way. Now it's just something that happened. She nodded slowly. She stood up and she looked again at the window at the campus outside at the gray sky over Columbus. She said, there's something I have to tell you. About Marcus, about the family. That was when I understood that the Hardcastle inquiry was not about my documentation. It was about something inside the Whitfield estate, and Marcus was at the center of it. And Adiz had chosen to walk through my office door because she needed a person she could trust, and she had run out of other options. I called James Whitmore again that night. I said, I need you to look into the Whitfield family trust. He said, how did you know there was one? I said, I know families. He said he would start pulling public records. He said if there was a trust document involved and Marcus's hospitalization had triggered a provision, we needed to understand the exact language before anything moved further. He said the word, we with the confidence of someone who has decided they are on a side. I signed the first letter of representation that evening. authorizing James Whitmore to act on my behalf in any matter arising from my professional relationship with the Whitfield family. There was no going back. The trust documents arrived on a Thursday. James Whitmore's paralegal, a methodical woman named Sophia Reyes, who I would come to know well over the following 3 weeks, prepared a summary. The Whitfield Family Revocable Trust had been established in 2004 by Gerald and Dorothea Whitfield. It held a substantial portion of the family's assets, the 3 dealerships, a commercial investment property on Henderson Road, and a residential property in Dublin that had been converted into a rental, generating approximately $9,000 a month. The trust had a provision. If a named beneficiary demonstrated a pattern of behavior that the co-trustees, Gerald and Dorothea, deemed inconsistent with the trust's standards of conduct, that beneficiary's interest could be modified. Marcus had been hospitalized for a substance use disorder. Gerald Whitfield had already spoken with Philip Harcastle about whether the hospitalization qualified as a triggering event. Adiz was also a named beneficiary. As Marcus's spouse, her interest was linked to his. I called Adiz on a Friday afternoon. I told her what James had found in the preliminary review of the public filings. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "They wouldn't." I said, "They already called Harcastle." She said, "He's their son." I said, "And you're his wife." Adiz, I need you to understand what's actually happening here. This is not about Marcus's health. This is about money and control, and the health crisis is being used as a mechanism. I've seen this before in other contexts. The documentation of his admission, the insurance records, the medical records of his treatment, these become relevant to a trust proceeding, which is why Gerald asked me what I would and wouldn't document. She said he was trying to keep it out of the records. I said he was trying to give himself flexibility, which is why I gave him none. She said, "What do we do?" I said, "You need your own attorney, not Harcastle, someone who works for you specifically, a family law attorney who has handled trust disputes." She said, "Do you know someone?" I said, "Yes." I gave her James Whitmore's number. I told her to tell him everything, not the family version but the actual version. She said she would. She also said, "Nadia, I want to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly." I said, "All right." She said, "Did you know, when you signed the admission, did you know all of this was going to happen?" I said, "I knew Marcus needed treatment. I knew I was the most qualified person in that building to provide it. The rest of it I've been piecing together the same way you have." That was true. It was also true that I had spent 14 years building a position from which, when a moment like this arrived, I would be the one withstanding. Those two things are not contradictions. Adiz met with James Whitmore the following Tuesday. He filed a protective motion on her behalf the same week, related to what he characterized as a premature and unsupported invocation of the trust's conduct provision. The motion required Gerald Whitfield's attorneys to produce the full trust document and the specific basis for their inquiry. It also formally documented Marcus's hospitalization as a medical event, supported by clinical records from Hargrove Ellison, which meant the Whitfields' attempt to characterize it as a conduct failure now had to contend with a paper trail that said something different. Gerald Whitfield called my office. I did not take the call. I sent a message through my administrator that I was happy to discuss Marcus's clinical progress through the appropriate clinical channels, and that any other matters should go through legal counsel. She thought she had a clear field. She had about 11 days. The Medical Executive Committee meeting at Hargrove Ellison happens on the third Wednesday of every month, in a conference room on the 4th floor that has windows on 2 sides and a long table that seats 22. I had been presenting at that table for 4 years and chairing segments of it for 2. On the third Wednesday of November 2020, I was scheduled to present the annual outcomes report for the Addiction Medicine Department. This was a standing agenda item. It was not special. It was not arranged for any particular purpose other than the one it always served, documenting what the department had accomplished and what it needed to continue. I did not arrange for the Whitfield family to attend. I arranged for nothing. I simply did not tell Adiz that the meeting was happening, and I did not tell Gerald Whitfield, and I did not tell anyone in that family that on a particular Wednesday morning, every clinical leader, administrator, and legal representative associated with Hargrove Ellison Medical Center would be in a room where my name was on the door. They found out because Dorothea Whitfield, who had been calling my direct line every few days since Marcus's discharge to express gratitude and to ask questions about his ongoing specialist appointment schedule. Called that morning, and my assistant told her I was in the executive committee meeting and would return her call after 11. Dorothea, who had been told by Philip Hardcastle that it might be useful to understand more about the professional context of her son's treating physician, asked if she might wait. My assistant, who knew nothing of what was happening and was simply being helpful, said the meeting was open to observers from the hospital board and family members of current patients in some circumstances, and offered to check. There are moments when the architecture of a situation becomes visible all at once, and you see not just the moment but all the choices that led to it. This was one of those moments, and I was not there for it. I was at the table, presenting slide 4 of my outcomes report, when the door at the far end of the room opened and Dorothea Whitfield came in, followed by Gerald Whitfield, followed by Philip Hardcastle, and this was the piece I had not predicted, by Adiz. Dr. Raymond Chu, who was chairing the meeting, looked at the door. He said, "Can I help you?" Hardcastle said, "I apologize for the interruption. We're here as observers. We have a matter connected to a patient case originating from this department." Dr. Chu looked at me. I looked at him. I said, "It's all right. This is a public meeting." Hardcastle chose a seat near the door. Gerald sat beside him. Dorothea sat beside Gerald. Adiz sat at the end of the row, and she looked at me from across the room with an expression that was too complex to reduce to a single word. She had not told me she was coming. She had made her own decision. I returned to my presentation. I said, "In fiscal year 2020, the Hargrove Ellison Addiction Medicine Service managed 412 inpatient consultations. Our 60-day readmission rate was 11.4%, compared to a national benchmark of 23%. Our bridge program, the post-acute outpatient protocol we established in 2016, achieved a 91-day treatment retention rate of 62%. For context, the national average for treatment retention at 90 days is 31%. I advanced to the next slide. I said, "This is the cumulative outcome data from our fellows training program. Since 2016, we have trained 11 addiction medicine fellows, 2 of whom now direct their own programs at Ohio State Wexner and Cleveland MetroHealth respectively. The training protocol developed here has been adopted in part by 3 other Ohio hospitals." I advanced to the next slide. Dr. Marcus Osei, no relation to me, a name I always had to clarify, who sat 2 seats to my left as the Director of Clinical Quality, said, "Can you speak to the Gorman Protocol? I think the board would benefit from hearing how that originated." I said, "The Gorman Protocol is a structured case review process I developed in 2017 following a patient death in our program. It requires a full multidisciplinary review of every adverse outcome within 30 days, with documentation entered into the department medical records system and available for quality improvement analysis. It has been running continuously for 3 years. Since implementation, our adverse outcome review completion rate is 100%. Hardcastle, who had been writing notes on a yellow legal pad, stopped writing. I said, "I named it for the patient whose case prompted it. I don't think we should be in the business of learning from people without acknowledging them." That was the first moment. The room was quiet in a way that rooms get quiet when something has been said that recalibrates the weight of everything around it. That was the first document. I had 3 more. Gerald Whitfield had his hands flat on his thighs, and he was looking at the table in front of him, which had no documents on it, which meant he was looking at nothing. Dr. Chu said, "Dr. Osei Mensah, can you address the funding picture? There's been a question from the Finance Subcommittee about the Bridge program's cost structure." I said, "Certainly. The Bridge program operates on an annual departmental budget of $640,000. In 2020, it generated, through appropriate billing of Medicaid, commercial insurance, and self-pay on a sliding scale, $491,000 in documented revenue. The net cost to the hospital for running this program is $149,000 per year. Our readmission prevention impact, using the standard calculation for avoided ER visits and inpatient beds, represents an estimated cost offset of $3.2 million annually." Someone at the far end of the table said, "3.2 million. I said, "Yes, that's a conservative estimate. It's in the written report." Hardcastle had put down his pen. This was the second moment. I saw it register in him that the inquiry he had brought into this room was not going to find what Gerald Whitfield had hoped it would find. I advanced to the final slide. I said, One additional item before I conclude. A clinical note regarding a patient admitted on the overnight of September 18th into 19th of this year. I won't use the patient's name, as that information is protected. What I will say, for the record, and for the committee's awareness, is that the admission was appropriate, the documentation met every required standard, and the clinical outcome to date is positive. The patient is engaged in ongoing treatment under this department's bridge protocol. I looked up from the slide. I said, an inquiry was made to this hospital's legal department regarding that admission documentation. I want the committee to know that I welcome any review of my clinical records, at any time, for any reason. Every entry I have made in 14 years of practice will bear scrutiny. That is not an accident. It is a choice I made very early in my career, because I understood that the day might come when my work would need to speak for me in a room where I could not speak for myself. Philip Hardcastle said, I'd like to clarify the nature of that inquiry. Dr. Chu said, Mr. Hardcastle, this is a clinical presentation. If you have a legal matter you'd like to address, you can do that through the hospital's legal department in the appropriate channel. Hardcastle said, Of course. Dr. Chu said, Dr. Osai Mensah, thank you, outstanding work as always. 12 people around that table said some version of agreement. Several of them, Dr. Marcus Osai, the Chief Nursing Officer Lenora Baptiste, the Director of Pharmacy Dr. Yusuf Karim, did so with the specific emphasis of colleagues who understood, in this moment, something that went beyond the clinical data on the slides. I collected my materials. I closed my laptop. I looked across the room at Gerald Whitfield. He had aged visibly in the course of 90 minutes. His jaw was set. His hands were still. He was looking at a point approximately 6 inches in front of his face, and he was doing the particular kind of arithmetic that men like Gerald Whitfield do when they realized that the position they took was built on an assumption that was wrong. He had assumed that dark meant weak. He had assumed that unannounced meant invisible. He had assumed that a woman his daughter-in-law had once described as working with addicts had built herself a life that could be managed or dismissed or redirected. Hardcastle leaned over and said something in his ear. Gerald nodded once, very slowly. Then he stood up. He looked at me across the room. He did not say anything. He picked up his jacket from the chair and he walked out. Dorothea stayed. She waited until the room had mostly cleared. She came to where I was standing and she said, I am so sorry. She did not specify what she was sorry for. I think she understood that the list was long and that specificity would not help it. I said, thank you for calling me that night. She said, you saved my son. I said, he did a lot of the work himself. He's been honest in his therapy sessions. That matters more than anything I did. She nodded. She pressed my hand once, briefly, and she left. Adiz did not leave. She stood near the window after everyone else had gone and I came to stand beside her and we looked out at the November campus together without talking for a while. Finally she said, why didn't you ever tell us? I said, I tried to once, in Mom's dining room. She said, that's not fair. I said, no, it isn't, none of it was fair. She said, I should have said something. When Marcus said what he said, I should have said something. I said, yes. She said, I was afraid of losing him. I said, I know. She said, you never said anything that whole time. You just built all of this and never said anything. I said what I needed to say to the people who needed to hear it, that was enough. She turned and looked at me. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness when things became serious. She said, are we okay? I said, we're working on it. That was honest. It was also the most I had to offer in that room on that day, and I think she understood that. The Hardcastle inquiry was formally withdrawn 14 days after the committee meeting. James Whitmore documented the withdrawal in a letter that went to Hargrove Ellison's legal team, to Hardcastle and Webb, and to the Whitfield Family Trust records, per the trust's own procedural requirements. Gerald and Dorothea Whitfield did not invoke the conduct provision. The trust assets, the 3 dealerships, the Henderson Road property, the Dublin rental, remained intact. Marcus's interest was not modified. Adiz's interest was not touched. This was not a small thing. The combined value of those trust assets, per the financial disclosure that James's motion had required the family to produce, was approximately $4.3 million. That was what had been in motion, underneath all the rest of it, while Marcus was in a hospital bed, and Gerald was asking me to keep things quiet. Marcus completed the inpatient stay. He enrolled in the Bridge program. As of the writing of this account, he has been in continuous treatment for 4 years. He attends therapy sessions twice a week. He has a sponsor. He speaks with some difficulty but with genuine intention about what happened. He told me once in a follow-up specialist appointment that was awkward in the specific way that all our interactions carry some awkwardness, that he had looked me up, that he had read the papers, that he had read the policy briefs. He said, I didn't know what addiction medicine was, I genuinely didn't know. I said, most people don't. That's part of why I do it. He said, I said something terrible to you. I said, you did. He said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. That was the only version of that conversation we have ever had, and I do not think we need another one. Philip Harcastle was replaced as the Whitfield family's primary estate counsel the following year. I do not know the details of that decision and I did not ask. My father retired from his position as a machinist at Eastfield Manufacturing in March of 2021. He came to visit me in Columbus that spring. He wanted to see the hospital. I took him to the department. I showed him the program. I showed him the outcomes board we keep in the hallway, the one with the readmission rates and the retention data, and the names of the fellows who had trained under us. He stood in front of it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, you did all this. I said, my team did all this. He said, you built the team. I said, yes. He said, you built it the whole time. You were building the whole time. I said, yes, Dad. He put his hand on my shoulder and he looked at the board and he cried very quietly, the way he had cried in that dining room 14 years earlier when I told him about the acceptance letter. And I let him because some moments do not require management. Some moments just require you to be present in them. I still have the piece of paper from my wallet. Patient outcomes. The ink is almost entirely gone now, you have to hold it at an angle to the light to see it. I did not throw it away. I put it in the frame on my desk, behind the glass, where it sits behind my certification from the American Board of Preventive Medicine. Nobody who comes into my office knows what it is. That is fine with me. I know what it is. My name is Dr. Nadia Osai-Mensah. I am the Director of Addiction Medicine Services at Hargrove Ellison Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. I have held that position for 8 years. My program has trained 15 fellows. My bridge protocol has been adopted by 7 Ohio hospitals and cited in 4 state and 2 federal health policy documents. Last year, I was appointed to a 2-year term on the Ohio Governor's Advisory Committee on Behavioral Health. I still see patients every week. I still update the outcomes board in the hallway every month. I still write every clinical note with the knowledge that someday, in some room I cannot yet see, my documentation will need to speak for me. I live in a 2-bedroom condo in the short north that I have owned for 8 years. I have a terrace where I grow tomatoes every summer, badly but with enthusiasm. I have a retirement savings account that Constance Park at Meridian Wealth Planning reviews with me every quarter. I have a college fund. I set one up 2 years ago for my godson, my colleague Dr. Marcus Osai's son, because someone should, and because I have the means to, and because that is what building in silence is ultimately for. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence cannot be taken from you by the people who never believed in it, because they were never in the room where it happened. 2. Documentation is not bureaucracy, it is the record of your integrity, and on the day it matters most, clean records will say what you are too composed to say yourself. 3. You do not need your family's understanding of your work to make the work real, you need the patients in front of you, the colleagues beside you, and the absolute refusal to stop. Was I wrong to never tell my family what I had built, to let them live for 14 years without knowing what I had become, instead of saying it clearly, even once, so that they might have chosen differently? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.